In this, the first session of Sunday, you'll see Alexander McCall Smith being interviewed by Karen Woods. If you enjoy the session, take a selfie and share your digital festival experience on our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram accounts to encourage your friends to join in too. So now, please give a virtual welcome to Alexander McCall Smith.
It is my very great pleasure to talk to an amazing author, a man I've admired for many a long year. I've read quite a few, never too many, but quite a few of his books. Yes, it's Alexander McCall Smith. And I understand, Alexander, you are no stranger to the Isle of Wight.
Well, no. I have been to the festival before, and I visited the Isle of Wight, and indeed my daughter, who lives in Oxford, she and her husband have a house there on the Isle of Wight. So they and my grandson and granddaughter are regular visitors to the Isle of Wight.
And you continue the tradition. Alfred Lord Tennyson, Keats, Charles Dickens, Lewis Carroll, they've all been there, and you too.
Yes, well, there we are. I wouldn't put myself in their company, but nonetheless, it's a very nice place.
Well, the chiming of the clock seems to indicate that we will start the interview. And we're going to talk about your books. We're going to talk about other activities that you're involved in, and we'll look ahead to the future. But first of all, it's the elephant in the room in a way, appropriate for the sort of African stories. The pandemic. What's it been like for you? You could say a writer is on his or her own, wanting some peace and quiet, but maybe 18 months of it has been a bit too much.
Yes, well, I think like everybody else, I feel that this is going on rather long, and I'm looking forward to the end of it, as I think everybody is really. It has made a difference to my life. I know that many people have been very tragically affected by it. We were fortunate in that respect, in that we haven't had that. But certainly my family, my daughters are both doctors, and they've both been subjected to this. They've been working with it in hospitals, and that obviously has had knock-on effect on their families. So they fortunately have recovered from that, but that it was always there in the background. As far as I'm concerned, it's made a major difference to my working life, in that I used to spend a lot of time going to literary festivals and signings all over the world, really, and that stopped very abruptly and very completely, and hasn't resumed. I am doing one or two live events now in this country, but not doing them abroad for obvious reasons. So there's been that difference, and that's meant that I haven't spent as much time as I used to spend in airports or living in hotels. And certainly in the past few years, I've had to do a lot of that. And that I think has been a bit of a relief. I must say that I'm not missing airports and air travel at all. And I think many people who, like me, had to do a lot of traveling probably feel that way, that this has been a rather peaceful time for them from that point of view. As far as the work is concerned, I think that it has had the effect of giving me more time to write, obviously. I think I'm fortunate in that I can, clearly as a writer, I can work at home, and that's what I've been doing. When the pandemic began, just by sheer coincidence, I was reading a couple of books on monasticism, including Patrick Leigh Fermont's wonderful book, A Time to Keep Silence, or Time of Silence, whatever the title is, in which he talks about visits that he made to French monasteries in the 1950s. And I was also reading a contemporary book on monasticism. And these books were making the point that our daily life in the world is far too busy, that we've allowed it to be too cluttered and too overcome with commitments and rush and all of that. And just, as I say, by coincidence, I was reading that when suddenly we were all thrown into this time of isolation. And so those thoughts were in my mind even before the restrictions came into play. And that made me think about my life. And I think a lot of us have thought about our priorities, have asked ourselves whether the life that we lead is sustainable, whether in fact we're not trying to do too much, whether we're not trying to acquire too much, whether we're not trying to make too many demands on our fragile world. And I think that it's been a time of reflection in that sense.
I think you won't be the only person who's gone through that experience and personal tragedy and the way the world has become is something that we are musing over. But as you say, 2020, 2021 have been busy years for you. 5 new hardbacks, 5 paperbacks released this year alone. Before we go on to talk about the wonderful lady, Precious Ramotswe, our famous lady detective, I was interested. Your publishers kindly sent me a couple of your latest books, and I was very much enjoying reading Pavilion Above the Clouds.
Thank you. A
standalone novel set just before the Second World War in Ceylon, of course now Sri Lanka. What inspired you to choose this topic at this time?
Well, a combination of things. One of them was the fact that I have been in Ceylon or Sri Lanka, obviously Sri Lanka now, but at the time of the book is set Ceylon. I've been in Sri Lanka on a number of occasions, and I've been very struck by it. It's a very beautiful country, and the people are very, very charming people. And I was intrigued by their country. And I began to become interested in the history of these tea estates in the highlands in Sri Lanka, and went to stay on one of those and was very, very struck by it. The whole story of tea is a romantic one. The idea of tea being grown in these beautiful remote hills, harvested, subjected to a very complex form of treatment with all sorts of tricky issues about its drying and its cutting and all of that, and then sent off by ship. In the past, I assume that it probably still goes by ship. I don't know whether they use air these days, but sent off to the other side of the world where it's enjoyed by people pouring their cup of tea. And that's a remarkable story. It's a very romantic story. Of course, the story of many of the things that we take for granted in our daily lives is a romantic and interesting one, but tea has that particular flavor to it, its story. And so I was rather taken with that. And then I wanted to write a story which reflected my interest in how people lead their ordinary day-to-day lives against the backdrop of extraordinary historical events. People carry on with their lives. They fall in love. They have families. They do their day-to-day work and so on. And all the time in the background, dramatic things may be happening. And this struck me as being particularly the case for people who were perhaps coming of age in the late 1930s, who witnessed the extraordinary global convulsion that was the Second World War. And when you think of the drama of people's lives in that period, without romanticizing it, I think one has to be very careful not to create the sort of rosy romantic vision of it. I mean, it was a time of great suffering and great fear, but nonetheless, many people rose to the challenge, and many people, of course, just had to carry on. Had no alternative but to carry on with their ordinary lives in those circumstances. So I decided to set a story of somebody in that position of a young girl who is part of this community of tea planters in the highlands in Sri Lanka there. And they had a strange life in that it was very lonely existence for these people. Many of them were Scots, which was of particular interest to me, obviously. and many of the estates still bear Scottish names. If you drive around those places there, you'll see estates called Edinburgh and Pitlochry and that sort of thing. So it was something that the Scots were very, very much involved in. So this young girl in this book has that background. And when you think that they spent their first 7 or 8 years in what was then Ceylon, in those circumstances, and then the children were sent back home, as they said then, although the kids would have been born in Sri Lanka, but nonetheless they're sent home to the UK. And what a business that must have been for both the parents and the children. Off they were packed, the very long sea journey back to the UK, to school in England or Scotland or wherever, and a very strange thought that, and then perhaps going back once a year if they were lucky, maybe having to spend longer than that. And of course that also applied to many children who were sent back from countries such as India, same sort of existence. A remarkable existence. So that's what I wanted to write about, and I found myself really drawn into the society. I spoke to people who had lived there at the time. They told me about their day-to-day life. I did quite a bit of reading about that, and of course I visited the place and tried to soak up the atmosphere of the place I was describing.
And it was a similar but not identical experience to what happened in India during the war and approaching independence. So it was fascinating. I know a little of that. I've read some of those books.
Yes.
And the sense of place, the beauty of the island, the pearl of the Indian Sea, very much came over. It's beautiful.
Yes. Well, that's right. I mean, also involved in that, an aspect of all this was the fact that this was the end of the British Empire. We're at the end of the imperial period. Now, not everybody knew that. Not everybody involved in it knew at the time that the writing was on the wall, or were able to see the writing on the wall, shall I say. But we're in the tail end of this extraordinary enterprise that was the British Empire, and it was coming to an end, and the whole thing was being unraveled. Peacefully in some cases, not so peacefully in other cases. There was a lot of trauma and disruption obviously involved. And so it's part of that extraordinary story. I mean, I find the whole story of the end of the British Raj in India an astonishing one. I was recently reading a book of memoirs of one of the Mountbatten daughters, writing about her life in India around about that time. An astonishing story, really extraordinary.
And the ambivalence about home. Young people, children, the tropical countries are all they've ever known. But everyone talks about home. It's something that's good, but yet it's scary as well. You caught that beautifully in the book.
Well, thank you. And of course, that's another interesting aspect. And this applies, I suppose, also today. There are many people for whom the concept of home is quite complex. In many countries, there are people whose identity is perhaps quite a complicated one, where they may be living in one particular country, but there's a sense that they have a home elsewhere, or they have a culture elsewhere to which they have some for which they have some affection. It's really very interesting, and I think that can be quite poignant when people have a sense of longing for somewhere else. Of course, it can take a nostalgic form if their longing for somewhere else has ceased to exist, for instance. But it is an interesting concept. The Germans have a word which expresses that when they talk about Heimat. They're talking about that sense of the place from which you are in a sense. And I think it's quite an important part of people's identity. I think that we want to have a sense of connection with place, a sense of historical connection, a sense of belonging. We want a sense of community. We're very keen as a species on community. People want to associate with other people, belong. They want to belong to other people. And of course, that's a very positive. I mean, that can turn negative and can turn nasty. But there's, in a sense, there's a very positive aspect to that, because that sense of belonging and community is what motivates us to care for others, to embrace others. And I suppose the trick is, how do you balance a sense of belonging and community with a broader responsibility to mankind in general? That's a delicate balance. But I think that we have, in an era of globalization, many people feel that they've lost that sense of belonging somewhere, because everything comes from somewhere else. Decisions are made elsewhere. And this takes us into really interesting territory about control of the decisions over your life, involvement in the decisions that affect your life. These are big these are big subjects.
They are. Maybe it's time to consider another country where that sense of community is very much is very strong, is very well known. Botswana, of course, and the famous location of the #1 ladies detective agency. You very much get the feeling that these are characters of their little country's capital, and you follow their very different lives to ours, but there is such a sense of community. They know who they are, where they're going, and we love finding out more about them. In your 22 books, 46, I have to write it all down, 46 languages, 20 million copies. We love your community out there.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I like writing about Botswana. I lived and worked in Botswana in the past, and I've visited it countless times. I'm very fond of the country, but what you say about them is absolutely right, that people in Botswana have a very strong affection for their country. They're very proud of their country and what it's achieved, and well might they be, because they've created a really remarkable country through their own efforts, their own hard work, and it's a good place. Their pride in their country is something which I find quite moving. Actually, I remember having a conversation with somebody some years back. Somebody was making a film about the books, about the story of the writing of the books, and I went off to speak to this man who worked in an orphanage just outside Gaborone in Botswana, and we were sitting there under a tree. And I said to him, we were talking about Botswana, and I said, are you proud of your country? Now, I could see that the camera crew thought that was a rather odd question to ask somebody, because we wouldn't walk around the streets in Britain and say to somebody, are you proud of your country? It would be a rather odd, but it was an entirely appropriate thing to say in those circumstances. And he looked at me, and he said, yes, I am very proud of my country. And he cried. And I was very, very moved. And I knew exactly what he felt. And Mma Ramotswe feels that about Botswana. She's very, very proud of it. And it's a great country. And they do have a strong sense of community, attachment to the land. Attachment to the land is really important in a country like Botswana, and so all of that I find very positive, and I try to bring that over in the books. Try to convey this sense that they have of their place being
Of course, your latest book, the Joy and Light Bus Company. Now, people might think, Precious, she's not becoming a bus driver, is she?
No. She wouldn't. I mean, I don't think she's the best driver in Botswana. She's got a tiny white van that she drives. I think she's probably a slightly erratic driver in that she gets from A to B and she doesn't. But she's often talking to Mma Ramotswe, her assistant, in the passenger seat, or she's often some sort of speculation of some sort. And so I wouldn't describe her as an exceptionally good driver. I don't see her driving a bus. No, the bus, of course, is something that her husband, Mr. J.L.B. Matakoni, who's a great mechanic, he's going to get involved in a bus company. And of course, I think when she sees her husband about to be involved in a bus company, that for most wives is a warning signal. I think, if one's husband comes along and says, I'm interested in investing in a bus company or becoming involved in a bus company, I think most wives quite reasonably would say, I'm not sure about that.
Well, as always, we won't go too much into the plot because that would quite spoil it. But as always, there's humour. And there's also, it struck me yet again, you bring today's problems with a different slant, of course, but you're talking about serious matters such as running a business, the good ways and the challenges about doing it. That's very purposeful, is it, that you seek to do that?
Yes, I think so, because I think that it's part of the job of fiction to reflect the face of the age. And although I don't dwell on negative matters, I don't really go in for description of confrontation and violence and things of that nature. I'm not saying there isn't a role for the contemplation of that in literature, but it just so happens that that's not my department. I'm more concerned at conveying affirmative matters, affirmative values, and that's fine. So at the same time, you can comment on matters which can be distressing and certainly serious matters, and you can do so in a way which doesn't depress, I hope, the reader, because I think it's relatively easy to write about misery and problems and confrontation. And those matters actually can even become banal. Even evil famously can become banal, really. But you can attend to these serious questions through humor and with concern about using a light brush. And in a way, that's a more effective way of getting the message across. If you're wanting to, I don't sort of sit here and think there's a message I want to, but I will certainly want to say things about subjects that I'm interested in. And I do have views on how we might try to lead a good life, which I think is probably the most important philosophical question that most of us face. How am I to lead my life? And so I think that is that's fair enough, that you can address that in a way which makes people think, but at the same time doesn't depress them too badly.
Precious is a good person and she's ingenious. She comes out with solutions. She makes things work out, and that's sometimes you wonder how's she going to do it this time. I was near the end of this book and I couldn't work out how it was going to end, and that's part of the charm as well.
Well, she of course doesn't really deal with the conventional concerns of the so-called detective novel, of detective fiction. These aren't really books about detection at all. There's a bit of it in the background, but they're really about people's problems and about their day-to-day lives. And so we never have any bodies or any murders or anything of that sort. That's not what this is about. But she does face problems, and she uses her extraordinary intuitive powers to deal with this. She's a very wise woman, and she's has an ability to understand human nature. She's very forgiving. That's one of her major characteristics. In one of the earlier books, she actually addresses that. She says, "I'm a forgiving woman. I think it's important to forgive," and I think it is. And when she wants to find the answer to a problem, we don't have all sorts of complicated clues. We usually have her just going and asking somebody something, and that's it. She takes view. You want to find the answer to an issue, ask somebody, and so they'll tell you.
If more people communicated in that simple way, then maybe the world may be a little better. I was very interested in reading background material about your good self, to know that you've written a children's series looking at the life of young Precious. I'd love to read those. Yes. They give you an insight into how she is, what she is in later life.
Yes, I've written a lot of children's books. I've written probably about 45, 50 children's books over the years. In fact, I wrote a lot of children's books before I started writing for adults. That's how I started, in a way, a long time ago. And I've written a number of books about the young Precious Ramotswe. Yes, when she's 8 or whatever, and how at that age she showed an ability to sort problems out. So she's using her powers of detection at that early stage. And these books are for children, and they were beautifully illustrated by Ian McIntosh, who's an illustrator who's done a lot of illustrations for my work, the jackets and that sort of thing. And Ian did the most wonderful illustrations for these children's books. So they're shortish children's books, about sort of 8,000-9,000 words, divided into chapters. So they're probably the sort of thing that a child of 7 or 7 up, well, 7 probably upwards might read. And I had great fun with that.
Well, that's definitely something I should be invested in. Christmas is sort of around the corner. That sounds like a rather ideal present. This, of course, takes us on to your other books. And forgive me, it wasn't until I had received all the information and Googled you and looked at your website that it dawned on me that we all love Botswana. And the story set in Ceylon is magnificent, but there are many others too. Many people in even on the Isle of Wight will have visited the beautiful city of Edinburgh, yes, where you might be able to find 44 Scotland Street. And I know many in the series, another one coming out right now. But I was intrigued. It's a novel serialized in a newspaper, which yes, takes us back to Dickens, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. The serial novels are very enjoyable. I very much enjoy writing them. There's an interesting story behind the 44 Scotland Street series, in that many years ago, I was visiting, I was on tour, and I visited San Francisco as part of my book tour of the United States. And Amy Tan, the novelist, said, "Well, when you come to San Francisco, we'll have a party and I'll introduce you to various people." And so I went to this party that Amy had kindly organized. And one of the guests there was Armistead Maupin, who wrote the Tales of the City, as you know, which was a serial novel. And now he wrote that in the San Francisco Chronicle. So it was the modern reappearance. It was, I suppose, the most notable modern reappearance of something which was absolutely standard in the 19th century, which was publication of a novel in chapters, chapter by chapter, in a newspaper or a magazine. Of course, Dickens, as you say, did it, but just about everybody did it. Tolstoy used it, Flaubert, and so on. It was a standard way of publishing a novel. Armistead made it, brought it back in a sense. And at this party, I had a conversation with him, and he said, "Whatever you do, don't write a serial novel in a newspaper." And I returned to Scotland, and I had lunch with the then editor of the Scotsman, and he said, I'd written an article in which I described this conversation with Armstead, and he said, "Oh well, why don't you write a serial novel for us in the Scotsman?" And it had been a generous lunch, and I said, "Well, why not?" And so the deal was on, and then I really had to sit down and think, my goodness, what am I going to write about? I'd come across a title in that I decided to set it in Scotland Street, which is a rather interesting Georgian street in the eastern New Town in Edinburgh. And but I didn't have any idea of what was going to happen. So I started to write it, and it started to appear chapter by chapter in the Scotsman, and it I discovered that I enjoyed it greatly. I finished the first book, volume, which was then published as a book, and now I've just written volume 15. So it's become, I think, the world's longest running serial novel. It just goes on and on. It's currently running in the Scotsman, this current volume, and then it comes out in book form. And I love writing it, and it can meander. It's quite a nice format involved, in that every chapter is about 1,100 to 1,200 words long, and I usually deal with one set of characters over 3 or 4 chapters. Then I change and start looking at some of the other characters. So it's a very meandering a novel, but readers seem to enjoy their annual visit to the world of 44 Scotland Street. I'm very fond of the characters there, in particular a little boy called Bertie, who has a very demanding mother, and Bertie, who was initially just a sort of subsidiary character in the story, has become one of the absolute highlights of the story. And I find it really rather odd, because I'm writing, these obviously are books for adults, this isn't children's literature, but one of the main characters is this 7-year-old boy. Bertie has been 7 for about 8 years. I'm not having him grow up as we go through, because he's so appealing, aged 7.
Peter Pan.
A bit of a Peter Pan, but I've so enjoyed that, and it just continues, and I do it every year.
They must feel like family members to you now.
They do, yes. I feel I know them very well. And indeed, that's the interesting thing about a serial novel, is that the readers feel that they know the characters as well. The readers feel that these characters in these novels are friends. We get a lot of letters from readers in which they say that they regard Mma Ramotswe as a friend, and sometimes these letters are very moving, in that they will say that they will describe how perhaps they had a difficult period in their life, and the friendship that they had with Mma Ramotswe, or some of the other characters, but principally with Mma Ramotswe, was very important in their getting through that. And I take that very seriously. It can be very, very moving.
Well, as they used to say on Blue Peter, time for something completely different.
Yes.
We've all heard of Scandinavian Noir. They're a bit gruesome, these TV series on Channel 4 or BBC4, set in Denmark or Sweden, and it's always dark and blood flows. You write Scandi Blog, and what's the difference?
Well, like everybody else, I found myself, particularly during the lockdown period, very much enjoying Scandinavian films, Scandinavian series, and sometimes, of course, these are very dark. It's the Scandinavian Noir, so one thinks of television series such as the Killing or The Bridge. Borgen wasn't like that. Borgen, which I think was one of the finest of those, was a political drama, which was quite refreshing, because I think it gets. And I found myself getting a bit fed up with the sheer body count in these things. The Bridge, there were bodies all over the place in the concrete and everywhere, really. And so I thought Scandinavian crime fiction is immensely popular. Why should Swedish Danish, Norwegian authors have all the fun, and couldn't the rest of us try our hand at writing Scandinavian crime fiction? So I created a character called Ulf Vag, who's a member of the Department of Sensitive Crimes in Malmö in Sweden, and it turns the genre on its head. Nothing, there are no bodies, there's nothing nasty, and Ulf is looking into very odd crimes, and of course he's an archetypical Swedish detective. He has problems with depression, he's having psychotherapy, he's got a dog who's deaf and been taught to lip read, and so on, and he drives the Saab and all of that. And I've had immense fun with it, and I decided to name this new genre Scandinavian Blanc, because there's nothing nasty happening in it. And I must say I've enjoyed that, and I've written 3 books in that series so far.
That's wonderful. That's another for my must-buy list. I think there might be a bit of snow around as well. No, you talk about Scandinavian Summer. You set them in the summer when it's always light.
Yes, I set there's several of my series. Indeed, my Scotland Street series, my Isabel Dalhousie series, which is set in Edinburgh, and my Ulf Vag series, they all take place in summer. That's an interesting point. I mean, I haven't really thought about it very much until you raise it, but it is summer, and that's because I rather like describing the summer evenings that they have, and so I'll have the characters looking at the last light of a summer sky, which of course in our latitudes here in Scotland, where it hardly gets dark at all, I'm speaking to you from just about 56 degrees north at the moment, and in midsummer we have these gorgeous long evenings. It just barely gets dark, and I enjoy describing those.
Mm. Well, I feel we're old friends now, so I'll say, Sandy, we know you as an author, but you have many other interests too. And I was particularly fascinated by the Great Tapestry of Scotland for a few reasons. I mean, we know of the Bayeux Tapestry. Down here on the south coast, there's the D-Day Museum with an overlord embroidery telling the story of D-Day, of course. You're telling what you inspire. I suspect perhaps you didn't sew it all, but you've inspired the creation of this wonderful tapestry telling the whole history of Scotland. Is that the case?
Yeah, well, my role was a small one. And this tapestry has been created by over 1,000 volunteer stitchers throughout Scotland. It's a wonderful thing. But the background to it was that there was a beautiful tapestry which had been designed by a very fine artist called Andrew Crummy, who does lovely, rather very, very approachable illustrations of various things, and he's influenced, I think, by the shapes of Celtic art, the round, the walls and the round shapes, and he'd done a tapestry which demonstrated or showed Bonnie Prince Charlie's progress through Scotland, the Battle of Prestonpans, and I went to see this. And I was really, really struck by it. I thought this is the most beautiful way of telling a story. I forget how many panels there were in that tapestry. It was quite long, but it wasn't excessively long. And when I reached the end of it, my wife and I went and had a sort of walk around it. And when I reached the end of it, there was the artist, Andrew Crummy, standing there. And I said to him, "This is a very beautiful thing that you've made. And give me your card." And he gave me his card. And I didn't have any particular idea then, but I went home and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a tapestry which told the whole history of Scotland from the Ice Age to more or less the present? And I thought this would be quite a good idea. So I phoned Andrew and said, "Would you like to design a tapestry which told the whole history of Scotland from the beginning to our own times?" And he said, I'd love to do that. And so I phoned various friends and said, I've got an idea for a tapestry. Would you like to be on the board of trustees? And none of them took more than 10 seconds to answer, saying, yes, of course we would. And so we started it without any preliminary studies as to whether this thing was feasible, as what it would cost, where we would put it, what would happen to it, so on. And then the teams of stitchers, the people who did the actual, Andrew did the artistic work, the designing, although a lot of artistry involved in the crewel work, which then was added to through which the drawings were realized. But these stitchers throughout Scotland, in groups of 8 to 10 people, met, and they started to work on this. And each of these panels involved hundreds of hours of work with these groups, and great friendships were formed because people worked together for months on a panel. And at the end, we were left with an object of the most astonishing beauty. It really is absolutely lovely. And if people want to take a look at it, you can see the website. If you search for the Great Tapestry of Scotland, you'll see what I mean about the beauty of the pictures. And we had the first exhibition of it at the Scottish Parliament, and the queues to get in stretched to Kingdom Come. It was extraordinary. They had to close the building. There were so many people trying to get in to see it. And I remember going to its opening and watching the reaction of people looking at these panels. And I saw people crying with emotion over this, because they saw things that they meant something important to them. They recognized their history, their place in this tapestry. Cutting this rather long story short, we then had to decide what we were going to do with it. We spoke to various people who were keen to have it. We were keen that it shouldn't be added to the already considerable cultural treasures that the big cities, say Glasgow and Edinburgh, have, and that would be a good idea if it went somewhere else in Scotland. And there was particular interest in its going to the borders, because the borders, as you know, is very strongly associated with textile industry, the mills in the border towns where tweed and other cloth would be made. And after a long process, enough money was raised from Borders Regional Council and the Scottish Government to build a purpose-built museum in Galashiels in the Borders, and that is now open. This gorgeous building, wonderful, big, totally purpose-built building, housing this great work of art. It's a good story. It's a nice story, and people just love the tapestry.
As we've been saying throughout this interview, we're back to a sense of community, aren't we? The community of Scots.
Well, I think that's right. Although it's the tapestry it's the story of Scotland, but it's also everybody's stories. It's not a narrow thing at all. It's obviously, it has its locality and it looks at particular instance, but anybody can see their own story there, because many of the themes are themes which are common to both England and Scotland and elsewhere, to everywhere really. Industrialization, the pains of deindustrialization, educational issues, literacy, music, the arts, all of that. So it's a universal story as well.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground so far today. What next for you? 2022 on the horizon. I'm sure you've got a couple of plans that perhaps you can share with us.
Well, Karen, yes, I've just finished the in fact, it's just been published. We've had the new Mma Ramotswe published, but I've just finished the next Scotland Street book. It's still running in the newspaper, but I've finished the manuscript, and so that's in production, or will very shortly be in production as a book. And I've started writing the next book in the Isabel Dalhousie series. So that's volume 16 of the Isabel Dalhousie series. Again, this is one which is set in Edinburgh. So I'm working on that at the moment, and I've got others that I will be doing. I've got no sooner do I finish one of the Botswana books, one of the #1 ladies detective agency, than I receive a telephone call from my agent and my publisher in New York, who seem to want a title for the next one. They say, "What's the next book called?" I've just put this last one to bed, but since they appear every year, it's a constant thing, and I've got to decide what Mma Ramotswe is going to do, and then what I'm going to call the book. I'm writing, working a lot with composers at the moment, which I'm enjoying greatly. I love working with composers. I write song cycles, libretti of operas. I've written recently finished a full-length opera with a composer, Tom Hyde, who's based in London, and we've really enjoyed working together. I've written the libretto. He's written the music for Act 1. It's a two-act opera. He's working on the second act. I'm working on all sorts of projects with composers, and that's very enjoyable. I've just started one with which is going to be great fun. I'm writing a series of poems about trees and the importance of trees in our lives for the Swedish music school in Stockholm, and they're going to use their senior students to write music around these poems and cooperate with children in Botswana in the performance of this piece, which is right. So there are all sorts of interesting things going on.
Well, we've covered the words today. Maybe we need to put time in the diary for another interview to talk about the music. Thank you so much for your time today. I've hugely enjoyed talking with you, finding out more about the books, the stories, and the tapestry. Thanks for your time, and thanks for being here at the Isle of Wight Literary Festival.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for participating in the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. Follow the Donate Now button from the homepage of our website. You can also benefit from great discounts by ordering via Blackwells Bookshop from our homepage. We'd like to thank the loyal sponsors and supporters who've sustained the Isle of Wight Literary Festival over the past years. Without their financial contribution, it will be difficult to attract the many wonderful speakers we've hosted, while keeping ticket prices down. This year, their support has enabled us to provide the digital festival free of charge.